They told me the crash wasn't my fault, but they still let him say it was. The day my entire career collapsed. Evan Mercer looked the board straight in the eye and said I panicked, that I lost control, that I wasn't cut out for the cockpit, and they believed him. No evidence, no hesitation, just his word over mine. That was the day something in me broke, and the day something else woke up. My name is Paige Russell, and I learned the hard way that a single lie can bear you deeper than any winter storm. But I also learned this: nothing stays buried forever, not the truth, not the person who told it, and definitely not me. The cold hit me the moment I stepped off the transport, sharp, metallic, familiar in a way I wished it wasn't. 8 years had passed since I last touched Alaska, since I swore I'd never stand on this frozen ground again. But orders don't bend for personal history, and the wind doesn't care what you left behind. Snow whipped sideways across the runway as I crossed toward the NATO briefing building, my flight jacket stiffening with frost. Inside, the heat barely held against the churn of boots and low chatter. Pilots from the US, Canada, Norway, and the UK filled the room, their eyes tracking me with open curiosity, some with poorly hidden skepticism. I was sliding into a seat when a laugh cracked across the space. Evan leaned against the far wall, arms folded, wearing that same smug expression I knew far too well. He tapped the empty chair beside him, as if this were some private joke. Look at that, Paige Russell. Didn't know they were letting groundside analysts into the real pilot's room. A wave of amusement rippled through the younger flyers, their glances sweeping over me like I was an intruder. My fingers tightened around my gloves, but I kept my shoulders still. No flinch, no reaction. Silence was the only answer he deserved. Then the door slammed open, and a gust of icy air cut through the room. Everyone snapped to attention, everyone except Evan. General John Merrick stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. Without acknowledging a single face, he walked straight toward me and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Major Paige Russell, codename Falcon 1. You may begin. Every smirk vanished, and just like that, Alaska opened the first shot of a fight I hadn't planned to face, but fully intended to win. When the briefing finally broke apart, I was escorted to a temporary cabin pushed against the far edge of the base. It was the kind of small, weathered wooden place my mother used to point out during long drives, saying she'd live in one someday when rescues weren't calling her name every night. The door creaked as I stepped in, releasing the faint scent of pine sap and old smoke. A draft slipped through the seams like a cold breath, brushing along my arms as I lit the small stove in the corner. The crackle of fire only made the memories sharper. They rushed in with the same force they always had my childhood carved by snow and absence, waiting for a mother who never stayed home long enough to thaw. The night her helicopter went down still lived in my bones, the storm blotting out every light in the sky until all I could see was white. After that, it was just me. My father had vanished long before I could even form a question about him. And then there was the other fracture, the one carved by a lie so clean it split my life in two. A single sentence in a Florida hearing, spoken with steady confidence, was all it took to erase years of flying and replace them with doubt I didn't earn. Evidence didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. My voice didn't matter. Here, in this cabin, Alaska felt like it was pressing its cold palm against those old wounds, reminding me they had never really healed. I was pulling blankets from a storage shelf when rapid knocks hit the door. A young officer stood outside, breath turning to ice in the air, saying General Merrick needed to see me immediately. He brought me to a small tactical room tucked behind the main operations center. A large Arctic map sprawled across the table, marked with flight paths, choke points, and temperature gradients. Merrick didn't waste a single word. He placed a black USB drive into my hand with quiet weight. This is real Russian Arctic strategy data. Hard to get, harder to trust anyone with, but I trust you. He didn't have to explain the danger. The metal casing was cold enough to sting, and when I turned it over, I caught the faint engraving along the edge F1. The same signature tied to a program I thought had been shelved long ago, one I'd only contributed to in shadow. I walked back to the cabin with the storm clawing at my face and one thought looping in my mind. why was it resurfacing now? Here of all places. By morning, the storm had thickened to a hard white curtain. I made my way to the operations wing, where the next round of briefings was already underway. The moment I stepped inside, every instinct sharpened. Today, I wasn't just answering questions. I was walking straight into a room, waiting to poke holes in anything I said. I laid out the mechanics of a whiteout, how it disorients depth perception, how ice blink tricks the eye, how radar scatter in polar air can lead pilots straight into mountains they can't see. Every detail mattered, and Evan knew it. He and his circle jumped on every opening, tossing provocations cloaked as questions, trying to tilt the room against me. Then the Canadian Brigade commander stood, his tone clipped. If Major Russell is confident her strategy holds, we'll validate it in a live simulation tomorrow. A test. Public, high stakes. Exactly the kind of pressure that once destroyed me. But this time, I wasn't empty-handed. I had real data, and someone higher than Evan watching my back. When the meeting dissolved, pilots scattered into hallways, buzzing with fluorescent light. I stepped out into air so cold it felt like needles. Snow hammered sideways as I crossed the walkway. My phone vibrated in my pocket. North Ridge. Tomorrow. They're setting you up again. A pulse of heat moved through my chest despite the cold. I lifted my head slowly. Across the loading yard, through the blur of falling snow, a figure in a dark parka stood perfectly still. Back turned, posture rigid. Before I could take a step toward them, the wind shifted, and the shape dissolved into the white like it had never been there. Someone was watching. Someone else was moving pieces behind the scenes. And as the gust cut across my face, it struck me with absolute clarity. This wasn't just another assignment. Alaska had never been just snow. This place was a trap, and I had just walked into the center of it. The simulation kicked off the moment I settled into the observation bay. The room washed in the cold glow of blue screens. The hum of electronics filled the silence, and for a moment it felt like slipping back into a cockpit I no longer belonged to. But the unease rising in me had nothing to do with nostalgia. Something in the data streams didn't line up. The northern radar feed twitched in sharp, unnatural patterns. Ice blink interference doesn't behave like that. Human fingerprints do. I pulled up the comparison chart, and the pit in my stomach tightened when the sensitivity metrics skewed off-map altered deliberately, and in a way I'd seen before. Then Frosty's voice cracked through the comms, panic slicing into the room. His simulated aircraft veered toward a wall of false terrain, altitude plunging as the system fed him lies. No one responded in time. I seized the channel and talked him toward the thin shimmer of real light bouncing off the ice ridge, the only thread of truth inside the white chaos. His breath steadied when he cleared the ridge, but the relief barely lasted a heartbeat. Evan broke formation next, diving toward a phantom target like the simulation existed to serve his ego alone. I ordered him back, but he brushed it off with the arrogance that once cost me everything. Moments later, the control panel lit red he'd overridden the safety constraints. When the simulation ended, I bypassed the debrief altogether and went straight to the server logs. The timestamp loaded slowly, screen glowing cold against my face. User Mercer. Time 21:07, 7 minutes before the run. It hit me harder than the Alaska wind outside. Evan wasn't just reckless, he'd touched the system. Again. And this time, I wasn't the one who was going to pay for it in silence. Alaska wasn't a training ground. It was a battleground for a very old war. I found Evan in the equipment warehouse, the wind outside howling hard enough to bend metal. Inside, the lights flickered in a sickly pattern, casting long shadows across shelves stacked with flight gear. He stood near the back, peeling off his gloves, that half-smirk fixed on his face like he was expecting me. I held the log up between us. His expression didn't crumble. It wavered. He stepped closer, the cold still clinging to him. "You don't understand," he said. "You don't know who wants you to fail." The faint tremor in his voice unnerved me more than his smirk ever had. Suddenly, the entire warehouse went dark. A beat later, the fire alarm blared, piercing and hollow. No smoke, no fire, just a manufactured distraction. Someone wanted me out of that room, and fast. I pushed through the exit into a blast of snow. That's when I saw him, a figure in a blue parka, standing at the edge of the lot. Posture rigid, head tilted just enough to watch me. A gust swept through, and the shape dissolved into white. My phone buzzed. Don't trust the system. Trust the terrain. My breath hitched. Someone was warning me, or using me. Either way, Evan wasn't the mastermind. By the time I reached the administrative building, snow clung to my sleeves. I shook it off and nearly froze in place. General Merrick stood in the hallway, uniform dusted with ice, eyes sharp. He told me he knew what happened years ago. He'd seen enough, and tomorrow, I would lead the strategic phase of Arctic Red Flag, no simulations, no buffers, no safety nets, a test, a burden, a reckoning, whichever it was. Tomorrow would end the quiet war I'd been dragged into one way or another. Arctic Red Flag opened with engines shaking the sky, the storm swallowing half the horizon before the jets even cleared the runway. I climbed into the tactical control bay as the wind slammed against the walls hard enough to rattle the steel frame. Outside, snow spun in violent spirals, erasing the mountains barely 300 meters away. Inside, the air felt tight, stretched thin by anticipation. Everyone knew today wouldn't behave like a controlled exercise. The moment the squadron lifted off, every radar screen in front of me went flat white. No terrain, no signatures, no return pings, just an empty, blinding field. A technician stumbled toward me, voice cracking as he reported that the system hadn't failed because of the weather. Someone had overridden it. This wasn't a drill. It was sabotage designed to hit when we were most exposed. Before I could respond, Frosty and Yuki's signals spasmed, their altitude spinning dangerously low. Their voices tore through the comms, frantic and disoriented. A whiteout this deep wasn't like flying through fog. It erased the horizon, flipping sky and ground, until pilots lost the ability to tell which way gravity wanted them. One wrong twitch, and they'd be gone. I shoved aside panic and grabbed the mic, guiding them toward the faint arc of aurora reflecting off the stellar range, a trick only locals know how to read. Seconds dragged like minutes before Frosty's shaky exhale came through, followed by Yuki's choked apology. If I'd hesitated, we would have lost them both. Then Evan repeated yesterday's arrogance, peeling away from formation and diving toward a phantom target produced by the corrupted radar. I ordered him back, but he barked something half defiant, half shaking. He wasn't chasing strategy, he was chasing a ghost. His signal jerked, then vanished completely. Static swallowed his channel. Someone in the room whispered that if he drifted another 40 miles, he'd cross into unmapped territory. A cold weight dropped into my stomach. No one else could save him. A thin, terrified voice finally cracked through my name, dragged out between breaths. He admitted he couldn't see, couldn't orient, didn't want to die. The same man who once shattered my career, now clinging to me as his last tether. But this wasn't about him. If he crashed blind, others could go down with him. I closed my eyes, steadied my hands, and braced myself. The real fight had begun. Evan's jet was disappearing deeper into the storm, and I had barely minutes to keep him alive. While reorganizing the remaining pilots, I stripped away the corrupted digital layers on my display and pulled up the raw terrain grid. If radar was dead, I had to navigate by instinct the way Alaska taught me before I ever learned to fly. My phone buzzed through my jacket. A new anonymous message glowed up at me. Don't trust the data. Trust the terrain. I looked out the window where snow hammered sideways in sheets. Terrain. The only truth left. I expanded the Chugach overlays, tracing ice curvature and the faint arc of aurora reflection invisible to anyone without local eyes. Evan wasn't just lost, he'd been funneled into the deadly white valley that no simulator had ever captured correctly. Then came another hit. A technician rushed in, reporting Evan's fuel levels were dropping into critical range, 90 seconds until recovery became impossible. 90 seconds to rescue the man who once walked away from me without consequence. Before I could steady myself, A Canadian tech sprinted over with a worse revelation: the override signal wasn't sent from Evan's cockpit. Someone else had planted it the night before. Not carelessness, deliberate design. I seized the mic, forcing authority into every syllable, guiding Evan toward the shimmer of aurora bouncing off the ice instead of the broken HUD lying to him. His voice cracked with guilt and fear. I cut him off and held him steady until, finally, his trace leveled out. 2 agonizing minutes later, he saw the frozen lake below and skidded into a hard but living landing. Relief washed through the room until the corrupted files revealed a new digital signature. X-12B, no match in the system, no name, no country. The saboteur wasn't Evan. He was only the pawn someone else had pushed forward. And somewhere out there in Alaska's endless white, the real enemy was still hidden. The sky over the NATO hall was the color of iron, wind slamming the windows hard enough to shake the fixtures overhead. I stepped inside in full dress blues. 14 officers turning toward me in a silence sharp enough to cut. Evan sat near the front, pale and rigid, hands clenched on his knees. I took my place at the podium, forcing the cold out of my palms as the first slide lit the room. I laid out every piece of what happened during Arctic Red Flag: his safety override, his break from formation, the phantom target he chased, the dive into whiteout, the danger he'd put Frosty and Yuki in. Evan shot to his feet, shouting that the radar had failed first. I moved to the next slide without touching his gaze. The server log appeared: user Mercer E2107, the night before the simulation. The room held its breath. Evan stammered, insisting it wasn't him, but I continued, showing the real mission flight path, how he had steered straight toward the decoy pocket created by corrupted data. If I hadn't intervened, we would be burying 2 pilots. Then I displayed the final slide: X-12B, the override signature no one could identify. A Norwegian officer asked if I meant there was someone else. I said Evan wasn't the only hand in the system. The room froze. Then General Merrick rose and revealed what I'd never expected him to say aloud. I was the architect behind NATO's whiteout warning algorithm. Falcon 1 wasn't a title, it was truth. Evan lowered his head. There was nothing left for him to deny. 3 hours after the hearing began, the decision came down with the finality of a closing hatch. Evan Mercer was stripped of his flight status, reassigned to a desk in South Carolina, far from any runway, far from any cockpit, far from the sky he had chased too carelessly. No squadron, no call sign, no applause left to hide behind. I stood across the table as he signed the paperwork, the pen trembling just enough to betray the emotion he tried so hard to swallow. When he finally looked up, his gaze met mine without the usual armor, no arrogance, no mockery, nothing to deflect with. Just a man forced to confront the wreckage he'd helped create. Paige, thank you for saving my life. I didn't answer, because the gratitude wasn't meant for the version of me he'd tried to bury years ago. It belonged to the version of him that might have existed if he hadn't let ambition and ego rot him from the inside. After he left, Merrick called me into a smaller briefing room. Snow ticked against the window as he closed the door behind us. Guyan. He told me the fighter wing would always have a spot open if I wanted it. One word from me, and I'd be back in the air, back in the seat that had once been everything. But I looked out at the mountains barely visible through the drifting snow, and the answer came quieter than I expected. I've fought enough. I don't need to prove anything anymore. I want to stay. I want the Arctic Defense Program. I want to train the pilots who listened yesterday and lived. Merrick didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if he had known all along. That's your path, he said. And for the first time in years, I felt it too. Night settled deep over the base when I finally stepped onto the runway. The snow glittered under the wash of green and violet light stretching across the sky. The aurora my mother once called the sky's breath. It moved slowly, like the heavens exhaling after holding tension far too long. I stood there in my heavy jacket, letting the cold wrap around me, listening to the wind whistle through the floodlight towers. No mocking voices, no accusations, no echoes of Florida, no shadow of Evan, just the crisp air, the northern sky, and the quiet that comes after surviving something that tried to break you. For the first time in years, The silence didn't feel like a punishment. I whispered into the bitter air, more to myself than to the sky above. I am Paige Russell. I am Falcon 1. And I am finally free. I didn't need anyone's validation anymore. Didn't need anyone to announce what I already knew. Freedom wasn't in the rank, or the aircraft, or the room that once stripped everything from me. It was here, standing under the same lights my mother loved. Recognizing that I didn't have to fight to exist. Some victories aren't won in the air. Some are carried quietly in the heart of the one who made it through. I turned back toward the base, the aurora shifting behind me, and walked toward the future waiting in the cold.